Fred stood before her, unmoving, like ancient walls that had stood for centuries, ramparts against which time itself could not advance, as if by the sheer force of his presence he could hold on to what was already slipping away, spilling through Anya's fingers and extinguishing like light sinking into water. His silence was heavier than any word, a shadow of the past reborn, reclaiming the space between them and forcing her to breathe shallowly, briefly, almost painfully, because every breath was choked with memories that refused to fade. Something pulsed in her chest, born of unrest and unnameable pain, and she did not know whether it was love resurrected or bitterness accumulated over years. Perhaps both, blurred, simultaneous, in the same breath, in the same thought. "Why now?" she whispered, though it was not a question but a cry, a howl torn from the depths of her soul, a shame she could no longer hide, and a weakness she could no longer keep locked away. "Why are you saying all this now? You're worried for me, but why? Why only now?" Her voice trembled, splintering like glass under its own weight, and in her eyes swelled a tide threatening to break, though she fought desperately to contain it. Fred looked at her as if his eyes could preserve what might otherwise be lost forever. Every line of her face, every tremor of her lips, every breath that was both theirs and foreign at once. Sunlight fractured in her hair, spilling into strands of gold, and in that light, she seemed like a being who could condemn him and save him in the same moment. He wanted to stay silent, and to speak in the same breath, to hold her and to leave her. But instead, the words found their way out. "Because I can't stay silent any longer. I can't stand by and watch you lose yourself to something that isn't you, to watch you vanish while I do nothing." "You have no right," she said sharply, her voice carrying both fear and defiance. But she did not flinch nor lower her gaze. "I know," he admitted, and within that confession was guilt, prayer, and defeat. "I know I don't, but I want it. I want every damned right to stand beside you, to protect you, to love you." "Anya." Her legs seemed to root into the ground at the sound of his confession. His words crashed against her like waves, stealing her breath, leaving emptiness in her stomach, a whirlpool of desperate longing to flee, and equally desperate need to stay. When he stepped closer, he smelled of rain that had just ceased, of the lingering smoke of a cigarette in his clothes, and of something that was his alone, long familiar, forgotten, but never lost. His hand, uncertain, tender, careful as though touching porcelain that might shatter, cupped her cheek, and her entire body shivered at that touch, at that old, forgotten recognition. "This is wrong," she whispered, but the whisper was weak, more a plea to herself to move, to retreat, though her legs refused to obey. "I know. Everything is wrong," he murmured, pressing his forehead against hers, as if seeking shelter in that nearness. "But not this moment. This moment is the only thing that's true." His words were soft, but in her soul, they tolled like bells, summoning memories. And then, as though everything else broke apart, he kissed her, not with the fire that consumes and destroys, but with the gentleness of something that heals, that begs forgiveness, that carries the weight of all the years and all the unspoken words. She closed her eyes, trembling, letting her lashes veil the moment and keep it safe within her, deep where no one else could touch it. His hands, without strength to demand or power to claim, pressed her back against the hallway wall, not an act of force, but a desperate attempt to halt time. His touch was a prayer, and she answered it with a sigh, quiet and releasing. A fire stirred within her, not the fire of sin, but of rebirth, a fire that cared nothing for James, nor laws, nor reasons. "Fred, if we go on," she whispered, her voice breaking under the weight of all she knew would follow. "Don't think about that now," he cut her off, his voice low but firm, like a vow. "Don't think. Just tonight. Just now. Let what we feel lead us, not what we told ourselves we must be." His words fell into her like rain upon parched earth, breaking the hardness with which she had guarded herself for years. She lifted her arms and wrapped them around him, as someone surrendering, terrified of losing what she had once been forced to let go. He guided her down the hallway, holding her with care, as one carries a treasure, fragile enough to be broken by breath alone. When they stepped into her room and the door closed behind them, the world ceased to exist. There was no James, no Rizzoli, no obligations, no laws. Only two people who had found one another at the edge of everything, on the brink of past and future. Fred embraced her, the way one embraces the truth when one no longer has the strength to deny it. and she rested her head upon his shoulder, eyes closing, finally allowing the burden she had carried too long to slip away. In that instant, the world fell silent, stopped turning, stopped breathing, for all that remained was the two of them, two lost, two found again. "Of course I want you to be happy," Fred said. And in the hush, his voice sounded like a confession, like a truth that had been caged too long. "I just don't want anyone to hurt you." His words struck her harder than she wished to admit, though she knew instantly whom he meant. Her heart pounded furiously, but she did not step back, did not let him go. Trembling, through the tears that defied her resistance, she spoke. "You have no right to decide what will hurt me and what won't. James and I have been together for months, Fred. Months. He is kind to me, gentle, caring. You don't know him, so how dare you judge him? How dare you tell me how to live my life?" Fred fell silent for a moment, as though every word he had meant to say had been swallowed by the storm of her accusations, leaving him defenseless before the sharp edge of her gaze, a gaze that rejected him and wounded him in ways he had never thought possible. In those eyes, eyes that had once been a refuge, a quiet affirmation that he was not alone in this world, there now lived betrayal, cold and unyielding, and it cut deeper than he was willing to admit, even to himself. He tried to reach her, if only with words, to soften the blow, but his voice betrayed him, fragile and broken, like a leaf torn from its branch by the wind. "I'm not telling you what to do. I just wanted to," he began, but the sentence faltered. "You have nothing left to say to me. We're not even friends anymore," she snapped, her words sharper than any strike. "After everything that happened? No, you're just someone who behaves like a complete stranger." She drew in a deep breath, as though trying to smother the tremor in her chest, to summon strength from the sound of her own voice. "He makes me happy, and I think you should accept that and step aside." Her words hit him like a blow to the chest, knocking the breath from his lungs, leaving him unmoored. His eyes, once calm, steady, and sure, now churned with restless waves, threatening to consume him. It wasn't only that she denied their friendship, it was the truth within her tone that left no space for him at all. He was unnecessary, redundant, unwanted, and the truth, however cruel, had nowhere left to hide. "He is good to me. He shows me understanding, tenderness. He loves me, and I love him. So go, Fred. Walk out of my life." Her voice was firm, but her hands trembled, betraying the strength she was forcing into her words. She did not cry. Tears were too proud to fall before him, and perhaps that was why her tone sounded even harsher. "I told you. I'm saying this as a friend." "No, you're not," she cut him off, her voice sharp, filled with both anger and hurt. "It sounds like jealousy." "Jealousy?" he echoed, with bitter mockery lacing his mouth and a clenched jaw. "Of what, Anya? Of the fact that you've given your life to a man who is—" "Stop! I mean it," she screamed, her eyes flaring with both fury and fear. "Stay away from him, Fred. This is no longer your concern." She lifted her hand as if to push him away, as if exhausted by the battle with her own feelings, as though one motion might finally rid her of him forever. "Leave, Stevenson. I don't love you. I don't love you in the slightest, and you can disappear, completely." "Why should I?" he said, stopping just inches away from her, his breath mingling with hers. "Give me one good reason. Just one." Their eyes collided like flames in a storm, and in the silence that fell between them, nothing remained but the raw weight of unresolved emotions, swirling like smoke in a closed room. "James is no good for you, Anya," he whispered, but the whisper carried the weight of a scream. "He is your sister's husband." "I don't care," she hissed, stepping across the room, but he followed, relentless, like a shadow without boundaries. "You're stalking me. Don't you see? No, Anya, you're the one who doesn't see. You're blind. Blind to what you're doing to yourself. Blind to where you're heading. And you're blind too, Fred," she fired back, her voice cracking through the air like thunder. "You became obsessed the moment you saw us together. Go to your wife. Go, because you are no longer welcome here." He groaned, wounded and frustrated, dragging a hand through his hair as if clawing for strength he no longer had. His words came out as bitterness, spilling past the rim. "Your lover?" he said, his voice steeped in scornful quiet. "Does he truly love you? I don't care. I couldn't care less. It doesn't matter." Something in him broke then. It wasn't anger. This was deeper, darker, like disappointment and despair clawing for release. He moved closer, suddenly, seizing her wrist, not violently, but with a desperate strength, as if he had lost every other way to keep her near. He pressed her back against the wall, her breath escaping in shock, short and sharp. "Really?" he whispered, a vein pulsing at his temple, his eyes blazing with unrest. Anya's eyes flew open, wide with shock at his nearness. She tried to pull away, but his hands, though born of desperation, did not relent. He pinned her palms to the wall, as though searching in them for proof that she was still his, that he still had a claim to her. "What are you doing?" she rasped, her heart pounding wildly, like a trapped bird in its cage. "Let me go. What if someone sees us?" "I don't care," he murmured, his gaze locked on hers. "What makes you believe that your sister's husband truly loves you, Anya Woodberg?" "He showed me. I know he loves me," she answered quickly, but her voice no longer carried certainty, only the stubborn desperation of defense. Fred laughed, but it wasn't laughter, more of a dry, broken cry disguised as one. "You deserve more. You deserve someone who sees you, who loves you as you deserve to be loved, not as a shadow of another man's wife. And maybe I don't want better. Maybe I want him." His lips stilled, and the air between them grew unbearable, thick with silence. "Do you truly want him?" he whispered, his grip loosening, though his hands did not release her. His fingers intertwined with hers almost unconsciously, as though memories had stirred awake and refused to vanish. Yes, I want," she stammered, choking on her own words. She never finished. Fred's lips found hers, and the kiss was born out of desperation, a prayer that had burned in his body and soul for months. Her lips trembled beneath him, and her body surrendered in a moment of weakness, as though only then did she realize how weary she was of fighting. His nearness, the warmth of his hands, the silent way he spoke her name, all of it pierced the wall she had built, tearing apart every attempt she had made to resist. And yet, reality struck suddenly, like a cold wind cutting through skin. Her eyes flew open, and she pulled away, gasping for air, like someone who had just broken the surface of a sea where they had nearly drowned. "Fred," she murmured, her voice nothing but a shadow, while her heart pounded wildly, relentlessly, as if it would never again find peace. But he pressed his lips to hers once more, softer than a whisper, gentler than he had ever thought himself capable of, as though seeking forgiveness that could never be spoken aloud. In that kiss, there was no force, only helpless confession, a desperate attempt to mend the emptiness between them, the abyss carved by years that had stretched, but never managed to close. When he released her hands, it was only so that he could draw her close by the waist, holding her against him as if to bind them, not by flesh, but by everything they had hidden too long, as though he believed he could weave together not just their bodies, but every unspoken word that had lingered between them like shadows. "Shh," he whispered, and the sound, softer than breath, was heavy, inevitable, and aching, as though he believed silence itself might preserve what had once been lost, as though he wished to halt time and hold them both on the very edge of eternity. And Anya fell silent, not because she wanted to obey, but because she no longer had the strength to resist. She was exhausted from fighting him, herself, the life that had torn itself apart in two opposite directions. When he kissed her again, stronger now, hungrier, with years of yearning that knew no other language but touch, she answered him, without thought, without resistance, with her whole being, with everything that had long been silenced within her. He let her go only to seize her hand and lead her across the room, and she followed without a word, guided by a force she dared not to name, as if under a spell. She bit her lower lip, trying to trap the warmth of his kiss inside herself, as if she knew each new breath would change everything. When he pressed her onto the table, it was sudden, enough to topple the lamp, scattering glass in sharp fragments across the floor. The sound of breaking rang like a warning, but neither of them listened. Their bodies made another sound, the sound of longing, of pain, of feelings confessed too late. A sigh broke from her chest, deep, almost painful, like a cry that had been caged too long and had finally found its way out. Her fingers clutched his collar, desperately, pulling him closer, as though she wanted him deeper in her breath and skin. With trembling hands, she fumbled to unbutton his shirt, clumsy, almost frantic, as if each button undone stripped away a layer of time that had kept them apart. He watched her with a faint smile, touched with sorrow and tenderness, as he saw her struggle with fabric and her own heart. And in her eyes, he saw something unquenchable, a flame that had waited only for his touch. When their lips found each other again, deeper now, slower, more consuming, everything they had never dared to say burned in that silence. He lifted her effortlessly into his arms, as though her body carried no weight, as though he had always borne her, as though she had always been his. As she bit softly at his lip, He carried her to the bed, and when he laid her down, it was with the tenderness of a man who knows he holds something precious, something that must not be lost. His body leaned over hers, his hands pinning her wrists gently to the pillow, not to restrain, but to assure her he was there, that he would not leave, that what they had lost might still, somehow, be within reach. "What's happening to you, Fred?" she breathed, her words breaking between desire and reason, her voice carrying more fear than the words themselves. "I thought we had put an end to this." He fell silent for a moment, wrestling with himself, before murmuring the truth that was both wound and confession. "I can't bear to watch him touch you anymore. I'm better than that living stone, Anya, and you know it. Deep down, you know it." He pressed his forehead to hers, searching her eyes for a final answer, a last permission, and perhaps even forgiveness. Her heart beat so violently she thought it might shatter under the pressure, and as she looked at him, she saw fear, love, sorrow, and helplessness. The harshest truth, the one that cut her to the core, was that beside him she felt safe, and that very safety was what she had been fleeing all her life, a refuge she dared not admit belonged to her. "Don't stop," she whispered, her voice more prayer than command. "Please, Stevenson." He answered with words steeped in the silence of yearning. "Let me show you one more time." His lips touched hers in a kiss both tender and immense, carrying the weight of a promise and a confession all at once. "Show me," she murmured, and her voice dissolved into his breath. When he lowered himself beside her, the warmth that flared between them surged like current, like life reborn from ashes. His face found solace in the curve of her neck, his words falling against her like hesitant rain on parched earth. "Be patient," he whispered, and she trembled, not with fear, but with the acknowledgement that had finally reached her. She had wanted him just as much as he had wanted her. His touch traced every layer of her being, every shadow she had hidden, every silence in which she had lived, and in his eyes there was not only desire, but guilt too, quiet and indelible, standing between them like a wound that would never heal. "Anya," he breathed, speaking her nickname with such tenderness it seemed he meant to keep her with it, as if he feared losing her. "You know this is wrong, but I can't stop." She turned her face away, her eyes brimming with mist, tears threatening to fall. Her hands, once searching for him, now trembled, powerless before the truth she had only just admitted to herself. "I know," she whispered, and every word was both confession and plea, defeat and hope, all at once. Fred lowered himself slowly beside her, never letting go of her hand, holding it gently, as if to say there was still time, that there might still be a way back. But both of them knew there wasn't. They had already crossed the threshold, already stepped into a world from which there was no return. The hours slipped into darkness, gliding soundlessly as if erased by an unseen hand, and the room was wrapped in a silence so heavy it pressed against the walls, and their breathing, lying between them, like a thick blanket woven of guilt, stolen glances, and words that had promised they would remain forever unspoken. They slept without sleep, both of them, for how could one close their eyes when someone they longed for more than they dared to admit lay only inches away, when skin burned with a closeness that should never have been allowed, when a heart hammered out a rhythm at war with conscience, and the past refused to provide any absolution. Anya lay still, arms thrown back, eyes nailed to the ceiling, searching for an escape among the cracks in the plaster, a fissure through which she might slip free of her own weakness. Yet what rose within her was like the tide, quiet but relentless, advancing slowly, thoroughly, sweeping away all the scaffolding she had built to survive. It was not a shattering one could hear, but a breaking in silence, destruction that left fissures deep inside, in places where cracks would remain forever. Fred's voice, when he finally spoke, was hoarse, muted, worn down not only by a night without rest, but by the weight of thoughts crushing him. "What will you tell Elizabeth?" His words fell between them like a blade of ice, slicing the air and the fragile space between their bodies sharply, precisely, and impossibly to ignore. The very mention of that name stopped Anya's breath in her throat. Her heart skipped and stung. That name was not just a name. It was a burden, a reminder of promises that must never be betrayed, of a sister who had trusted her. She blinked slowly, as if she could erase from her eyes the image that refused to leave, the look in her sister's gaze, confused at first, then wounded, and finally wrapped in the terrible, suffocating silence of betrayal. "I won't tell her anything," she said, her voice drained of color, hushed, almost lifeless, as if each word were torn from her throat against her will. "Because this This with James should never have happened. Silence lingered only a moment, but it was long enough for the weight of Fred's truth to settle over it, undeniable and final. But it did. His voice carried neither accusation nor comfort. It was level, stripped to the bone, and you won't be able to pretend it didn't. Anya closed her eyes, and in the darkness behind her lids, the vision she had been fleeing came alive, the image of Lizzie on the threshold, her eyes shifting from confusion to hurt to silence, silence to the irrevocable wall of loss. And then James, the man she had tried to love, his hand in hers, his steady care. It had seemed enough until Fred reappeared, igniting a fire she had spent months extinguishing, convincing herself that to smother it was the same as to survive. "You are my sin, Fred," she whispered, her voice soft, thick with the confession she had feared to give but could no longer contain. "But the only one who ever made me feel alive." Those words were no excuse, nor an accusation. They were surrender, a naked acknowledgement of weakness that was also her deepest truth. Fred rose slowly, like a man whose every motion bore the weight of what he had done, without haste, without anger, without any gesture that could be mistaken for triumph. His rising was the movement of a weary soul who had realized he had touched what he should not, taken what was never his, and that the eternity he had stolen, no matter how brief, would haunt him to his last day. "Then we'll both have to live with it," he said. The words were simple, yet heavy with pain that required no embellishment. With who we are, and with what we've allowed ourselves to become. He stood before the door of her dormitory, his hands hanging at his sides, his eyes fixed on her, and still he did not open it. He only looked, as if trying to carve her face into his memory, knowing he would return to it 1,000 times, in dreams, in the quiet of nights, in moments when recollection would catch him unaware. "Goodbye, Anya," he said at last, softly, but with resolve, like a man who had forced from himself his final line. She did not answer. She only watched as the door closed behind him, slowly, quietly, almost tenderly, as if even it knew that there had never been a right moment for them. As if the wood itself wished to preserve the dignity of their last look, their last breath, their final nearness. For their story had never been meant to be more than a forbidden longing at the wrong time. And yet, that day, for one stolen, cursed, and undeniable moment, they had been everything. The faint click of the latch was the final blow, silent but absolute, the sound that severed what was never meant to be joined. She was left alone, in a room still steeped in his scent, in theirs, in what should never have happened, yet had, fiercely, overwhelmingly, against which no decision, no morality, no vow had stood a chance. Her sister's name echoed in her mind, Elizabeth, a gentle name that had turned sharper than a blade, reminding her that she deserved the truth, deserved a sister who would not falter, deserved a world where betrayal did not come from the hands closest to her. But Anya had faltered, fallen before the one gaze that had always been her weakness, before the man who knew how to touch the places in her no other hand had ever reached. Of course, none of it had ever been an accident, nor did it resemble some banal game of fate where two people stumble and end up in each other's arms, breathless, half undressed, like characters from a poorly written trivial romance. Their story had stretched too long to be reduced to a mere lapse of weakness. Between them there had always been a spark, quiet, patient, and hidden beneath layers of silence. It smoldered like embers beneath ash, never extinguished, only pressed down, disguised in propriety and reason. And when it finally flared, it did not resemble reckless fire, but something inevitable, a law of nature their bodies simply obeyed, a destiny whose script had long been written, waiting for them to surrender and play it through. It happened in a heartbeat, though neither of them could have said whether it was a sudden break or something that had been gathering for years, accumulating in glances left unspoken, truths swallowed into silence. If there was a trigger, perhaps some small thing, like a word or a memory resurfaced, it could never explain the way they touched each other, nor the rawness of that kiss that felt like a last breath, like salvation from drowning, like a desperate need to vanish into one another, because outside of it, no life remained. Their hands did not strip away clothing like strangers in haste and hunger, but slowly, reverently, almost with awe, as though touching a relic, brushing dust off something too precious to rush. In every caress, there was not lust, but recognition, a confession they had denied for too long. the truth that they had never truly belonged to anyone else, not even to themselves, as much as they had always belonged to each other. And when all excuses fell away, when everything stood naked without disguise, what remained was the bare truth. It happened because nothing else ever could have, because to resist any longer would have been just another lie, and their time for lies had long passed. Mornings met them without mercy, sharp and unkind, pouring light over the bed still steeped in the scent of their night, leaving them nowhere to hide. They lay tangled in silence, and within it a single thought, pulsed, stripped and unrelenting. It happened. God, it happened. There was no alcohol to blame, no drug to cloud memory, no excuse to shift the burden from their shoulders. Everything that had passed was sober and deliberate. Every touch had been a choice, every movement their own, each breath an act of will to stay, not accident. If some final quarrel or trace of conflict had stirred what they felt again, it had not been the reason. The reason was older, buried deeper, stubborn as a seed that never ceased to sprout, no matter how much sand and stone had been piled atop it. What happened did not belong to a moment, but to a truth that had slept in them for years, a witness to their lies, a reminder that what they buried had never died. That day they stripped themselves of every mask, every role played for others, every obligation taken on, until they stood bare, not only in body, but in soul, unable to hide anything more from one another. They forgot his vows, her duties, the walls they themselves had raised, because what bound them was stronger than boundaries, and stronger than law. It was not a moment of passion alone, but a day of confession, a day of truth, a day where they showed each other how unfree they were in the lives they lived, and yet how paradoxically free in that single, forbidden point where their bodies and souls collided. But after that day did not come peace or relief, only colder, heavier chapters that opened silently and inexorably. The first arrived in a gray morning bathroom, where Anya stood motionless, staring at two thin pink lines, fragile and small, yet powerful enough to stop her breath and turn her world upside down. Those lines were finer than a strand of hair, yet carry the weight of the world, because in that instant, she knew that nothing would ever be the same. Just a few seconds were enough to shatter everything she had leaned upon, to open a door through which there was no return. Then came denial, desperate attempts to turn back time, to erase her own footprints in the sand, to flee from the mark that now lived within her body. She told herself it was possible, that she could go back to the moment before their lips had met, before every touch had burned itself in as a seal. But truth proved stubborn, like the morning sickness that refused to fade. Her mornings turned bitter, metallic, and heavy. She understood that her body was no longer hers alone, and that there was no more running. Later came the first shades of acceptance, stained with sorrow and fear. Days passed, and she tried to gather her thoughts, to carve meaning out of her new reality. That was when the pain deepened, when the man who had awakened her heart, who had been both her sin and her sanctuary, revealed himself incapable of facing the consequences. Fred stood before her as a stranger, motionless, powerless, and unable to bear the weight of what he had made. And then, as days turned to months, another chapter opened, not lighter, but gentler, for it carried the promise of life within her darkness, a light breaking through shadows. Yet even that light was draped in fear, because Fred still belonged to another woman, to another life, to a past that had not died. His silence cut deeper than words, for in it Anya heard indecision, cowardice, and refusal. She knew then that she bore a child born of a love that should never have existed, and yet it had shaped her. The fiercest chapter came with truth, the kind that can no longer wait. The confrontate that followed was a rupture, a breaking of bones, for there was no room left for silence. Words fell like exposed wounds. Fred, unable to escape himself, fled from her, from the responsibility, from the flood of feeling. Anya stood before him, vulnerable, yet proud, wild with love, broken to her core. And when his cold words came, that the child was not his, she felt something within her extinguish forever. It was not love, for love was stubborn and clung on, but faith, faith that he had ever truly been hers. She closed the door behind her without turning back, her footsteps echoing down the hallway like the heartbeat that had ceased for them. She left behind everything they might have been, but she did not leave as a victim. She left as a woman refusing to kneel before a man who could not love fully. He had not only rejected the child, he had rejected her, her most honest and most courageous part. And that wound cut deeper than anything they had endured together. That night, As she lay in a bed that felt less and less like comfort and more like a prison of her own thoughts, her body turned restlessly, as if shifting positions could somehow free her from the weight pressing within. Sleep remained elusive, while the same relentless questions traced circles without end in her mind. Images returned, sharp and stubborn, heedless of time or reason, impervious to every attempt at forgetfulness. In that long, heavy wakefulness, her eyes absorbed the moonlight spilling gently across her features, leaving silvery traces on her lashes, as though the light itself was trying to wrap her in a quiet embrace, one that asked for nothing, one that sought only to soften, if just for a moment, the tightening in her chest. When she rose, she did so almost soundlessly, with a movement of surrender, as though she was not leaving the bed so much as abandoning herself. She wrapped herself in a white robe, worn thin at the elbows, but still steeped in a scent that carried the shadows of past days. A scent of home, clean and familiar, yet admonishing too, for it stirred within her the things she longed to keep buried. Her steps led her down the hallway, through walls that remembered laughter and silences, into the living room, not with any clear purpose, but driven by that inescapable need that couldn't be spoken. It was a summon from within, raw and insistent, the need to see him once more, not in the fleeting present that kept slipping away, but in the past which, however painful, still held shape and scent and voice. The dark walnut cabinet stood like a keeper of secrets, and when she pulled open the drawer, untouched for years, it felt as though she was breaking into a forbidden place. Her fingers trembled as they moved through the contents until they stilled on a black videotape, a quiet reliquary of a former life. It was coated in dust, yet intact, as if it had been waiting for this very moment. When she wiped it clean, she did so gently, almost reverently, as though brushing away not only the years that had gathered upon it, but those that had gathered upon her own heart. Each particle of dust that lifted seemed like a memory freed once more, and in that ritual of movement there was both fear and need. She slid the tape carefully from its sleeve, as though holding something fragile, something that might shatter, and placed it into the old VCR. The mechanism groaned, but it worked. She sank into the couch, its softness enveloping her but offering no comfort. Curling herself into a ball, knees drawn to her chest, arms locked around them, she looked like a child seeking shelter. Silence filled the room, thick and palpable, a heavy substance spreading through the space. For a moment, her eyes flicked toward the hallway. Kai was not there. The house breathed in its nighttime stillness, and in the realization that she was unseen, that no one could witness her like this, stripped bare and helpless, she found a strange freedom. In that moment, without words, but with a devotion akin to an oath, she pressed play. The image burst onto the screen, alive and far too familiar, not as a mere projection, but as the return of a reality that had never truly left. James was there, young, assured, wearing the smile that had once been her shelter and her strength, and was now given to another. His gaze belonged to Elizabeth, her sister, and in that gaze, in that silent exchange that required no words, she read everything. She drew in a deep breath, fighting the urge to run, to stop, to erase every frame that carved into her insides. She could have risen, destroyed the tape, cast it all aside, but she stayed. She stayed because she knew there could be no escape so long as she denied it, because her mind needed proof of what her heart had long since known. She stayed for the child sleeping only a few steps away, for the strength that child demanded of her could not be built upon lies. She stayed for herself, because truth, however searing, was the only path forward. Frame by frame, blink by blink, she searched for something beyond the image, something that might grant meaning, justification, perhaps even salvation. But all she found was pain, quiet and unyielding pain, gnawing slowly and ceaselessly, like an old wound that never heals. The recording was 11 years old, and yet it cut like a fresh gash, raw and bleeding, because what she was watching was not a film, not a fiction. And as she sat there, breathing softly, her eyes too exhausted for more tears, she understood that the past does not return, but neither does it vanish. It lingers, seeps into every morning and every night, a shadow that never departs, a silent companion that never lets her forget that what was once lost continues to live within her still. "Hello," he uttered softly, though the words sounded more fragile on his lips than he had intended. The smile he tried to carry before him was uncertain, more like a thin mask hiding his discomfort than a genuine sign of ease. And yet, in his eyes, a warmth flickered that for a brief instant overcame his unease, a small flame that was at once a question and a wish, a restlessness that could not be stilled by the gentle curve of his lips. "Hello," Anya replied, her voice quiet but tinged with a brightness that was neither insistent nor heavy, but gentle and discreet. It seemed as though the spontaneity of her tone had cut through the invisible barrier between them, releasing the silence from the tension that had been gathering there. There was nothing in her words that demanded attention, and yet it was precisely that unassuming quality that stole his breath, for in her voice there was a strength that sought no proof, but was felt naturally. He looked at her more carefully now, almost cautiously, and there she was, before his eyes. "Seems we're going to be stuck together in the kitchen," he mumbled, somewhat awkwardly, and the shifting of his feet, as if the ground had suddenly turned slippery, betrayed the restlessness stirring within him. There was something boyish in him, something that made him vulnerable, and it was this very vulnerability that gave his awkwardness a certain weight. "So it seems, doesn't it?" said Anya, her voice carrying a soft irony, not mockery, but a subtle shade of play, as if inviting him not to fear his own unease. Her eyes, open and curious, looked at him without restraint, allowing him to feel within their depths that she saw more than he wished to reveal. "You know, I don't think we've ever really been properly introduced, which is, when you think about it, rather odd, considering you've been in our lives for months now." "Yes, it seems this is the first time we've truly had the chance to talk. Or something like it," he answered, and the unconscious gesture of his hand brushing his chin betrayed how discomfort rose up his neck, leaving behind a trace of unease that no smile could quite conceal. "Anya Woodberg," she said simply, extending her hand. The gesture was natural, unforced, yet when she spoke her name, it resonated in him as something self-possessed and firm. "James Livingstone," he replied, taking her hand, and that touch lingered a heartbeat longer than it should have. Between their fingers remained something neither of them wished to define, and even less to break. His cheeks flushed faintly as he added, "Elizabeth's husband." "It still sounds a little strange," she remarked, glancing at him from beneath her lashes. On her lips played a smile that was not merely a smile. "I think Father still hasn't forgiven you for marrying her without asking, without warning, without anything at all." "Yes," he murmured softly, almost shyly. "I believe you're right." Anya nodded, and the look she gave him was not one of judgment, but of someone who wished to understand. "Why are you nervous?" "Nervous? Me?" "Not at all." He laughed too quickly, and it was that very haste that betrayed him. It was a weightless jest, an attempt to blur the truth, but he lacked the strength to conceal the tremor within him. Of course," she replied calmly, without pressure, without the need to contradict him. In her tone there was a quiet knowing, an understanding that sought no explanation, and she let him wrestle with himself, as though by granting him that freedom, she gave him release. It was unfair how much Anya resembled Elizabeth, almost painfully so. Their light brown hair spilled in the same way across their shoulders, and their eyes held the same shade of oceanic depth, where curiosity and longing intertwined. But there was a difference, subtle yet decisive. Elizabeth had that dimple in her cheek, a charming mark that set her apart, while Anya carried silence, lunar and unassuming, a silence that conquered not by force, but by its quiet constancy. Elizabeth was a star, brilliant and radiant, conquering by light, while Anya was the moon's reflection, subtle and hushed, present in a way that becomes obvious only once it is gone. And in that silence lay a danger James could not decipher. That evening, as he stood before her, he was awkwardly charming, and it was that very awkwardness that touched Anya, that made her heart tremble and, against her will, yield to the inexplicable law by which hearts fall silently, unobtrusively, yet inexorably. He was captivating not because he sought to be noticed, but because he did not need to seek. His very presence carried a stillness that drew her in, and within that mixture of closeness and untouchability lay a peril she could not resist. But he was her sister's husband, and every thought that led toward him was wrong, irrevocably, deeply wrong. And it was precisely in that wrongness that the force of her feeling became all the more irresistible, for what must not happen becomes what the heart desires most. That was why Anya's gaze sought Elizabeth and James, searching for a sign, any confirmation that she was lost, that everything in her mind was only an illusion. But no answer came. Perhaps they really had been flirting. Perhaps Elizabeth wished to hold him. Perhaps James returned it. Or perhaps it was all only a game of her imagination, an illusion fed by her own longing. She should not have felt jealousy. This was her sister, her blood, and even the presence of such an emotion was an insult. Yet when Elizabeth, passing by, carelessly brushed James's hand, Anya felt she would give anything for that touch to be hers, for that smile to belong to her, for that moment to be hers. Desire burned through her like a wound that did not bleed outwardly, yet would not cease within. She wished it was she who smiled at him, while her heart trembled, but the path before her was not hers, perhaps never was. Perhaps their paths had crossed only briefly, just enough to stir unrest, and perhaps fate already knew then what she was only beginning to realize, that some glances never lead to fulfillment, but remain an eternal yearning, an unending question, and a wound that never ceases to breathe. Tears, those stubborn and uninvited traitors of the soul, welled up in her eyes once more as she sat wrapped in a darkness as thick as fog, almost tangible in its weight. She watched the same frame again and again, endlessly, as if trapped in a circle of obsession with no way out. She knew by heart every word that would be spoken, every gesture, every glance, every slight tilt of the body, and yet something in her refused to stop, as though, if she only kept watching long enough, if she remained steadfast in that silence, she might read between the lines, find a flicker, a nearly invisible sign, a shadow of confirmation that what she felt was not a mere illusion, not just the deceit of her own heart, but something real, something she could touch, however fragile it might be. The question that haunted her was simple, and yet devastating. Why had he never been that way with her? Why had he looked at her with eyes that were warm but hollow, eyes that carried tenderness but not fire, while he looked at Elizabeth as though he was gazing at the entire world, as though she held within herself all the light a man could endure? Why had he breathed with her sister as though they shared the same breath, while with Anya he always seemed like a man struggling against an invisible wind, a man who could not find peace within his own being, let alone in her embrace? Those questions, raw and bare, tore through the silence of the room, wounding and burning, and there was no one to ask them of but the reflection of her own face, blurred against the dark glass of the old screen. The sense of betrayal was unbearable, but along with it came the poisonous sediment of guilt, for the betrayal was mutual, against her sister, whom she loved more than herself, and against that quiet, hidden woman within her own soul, a woman who had hungered for years for love, for warmth, for the acknowledgement that she was enough. Perhaps the line had been crossed long ago. Perhaps it had all begun the day she first felt the joy of his gaze upon her, that moment she realized she hoped for him. That, most likely, was when she had stepped into a space from which there was no return, and everything that followed, everything she had justified by her hunger to be seen, to feel, even for a fleeting instant, what Elizabeth had every day, was now coming to claim its price. And the price was steep, for here she sat, before the glow of the screen, realizing that payment was exacted in her own undoing. Her fingers, almost without thought, pressed the rewind button, and the soft hum of the tape, the fragile buzzing of the past, filled the room. It was the machinery of time, unyielding, pulling her back into images she both desired and despised. She replayed the moments, as if in repetition she might uncover one last hope, that somewhere, along the way, something would look different, that a crack would open in reality, through which she might slip, and carry away at least one alternative, one proof that it could have ended otherwise. Though she knew she was only wounding herself, that it was nothing but a form of self-torment, she could not stop. She was a prisoner of her own labyrinth, lost among past smiles, gestures, half-suggestions, caught in endless interpretations that might have been real, or might only have been reflections of her own desires and her desperate projections. Every scene on that recording was known to her, down to the very ache, to the tremor in her hands. She knew when Elizabeth would lower her head, when James would take a step back, when his lips would quiver slightly before speaking her name. And despite that complete predictability, or perhaps because of it, Anya still searched for something new. One more disappointment, one more defeat, and a battle she should never have begun would break her forever. It hurt. It hurt more than love had any right to hurt, more than any bond, no matter how imperfect, could ever justify. It was a pain without scream, without cry, quiet, relentless, and endlessly deep. A pain that did not show itself, but ate away within. A pain that, in silence, eroded every thought and every hope. It was not a sudden blow, nor a wound that could be patched and forgotten, but a stone in her chest, a stone she could not drop, because it had already become a part of her body and her soul. When her gaze slipped down the screen, down the light that flickered across the walls and painted shadows like scars, she was left alone in that room where only her heart had a voice. And then, in a silence heavier than words, with bitterness tightening her throat, Anya whispered, as though confessing without witness, the thought she had swallowed for years, the thought that now burst out of her, raw and merciless. Why, for God's sake, did I have to take that damned camera? "Oh, Lizzie," he said with a smile, glowing with the warmth of intimacy, his eyes shining with a kind of harmless yet unmistakable joy. "Are you sure you don't want to rehearse that kiss waiting for us later at dinner? Haven't we practiced enough for one evening?" she teased, though the sudden blush that rushed to her cheeks betrayed what she had tried to hide beneath the playfulness. "It's never enough," he replied, pulling her closer with that sure, almost playful charm, but also with the inevitable resolve that spoke of her kisses as more than a game, as breath itself, as a need. "I can never get enough of your kisses. How am I supposed to pretend I don't want to kiss you in front of our parents?" she whispered, lowering her voice to the edge of pain, as if the words themselves were confession that should never have been spoken aloud, and yet they slipped out, colored with a tremor that carried into her lips. "I don't know. The same way I'll pretend I'm not dying to touch you in front of them," he answered softly, but with a warmth that slipped beneath her skin, as though his very voice carried the bitterness of restraint and the fire of a desire that could never quite be hidden. "Perhaps," she murmured, and in that reluctant agreement, there was both sorrow and surrender. Then she kissed him quickly, but in that brief, smoldering touch lived everything they could not say, everything they were forced to keep between themselves, poised on the edge of silence and confession. "Everyone probably laughs at us for scheduling kisses when we're already married," she added, trying to bring a lightness into the silence that threatened to swallow them, though her lips still trembled from his closeness. "I know. Let them laugh," he answered, and kissed her again, this time deeper, as if in that single gesture he longed to hold back time, to stretch it out and stop it, to make eternity out of just a few seconds. Anya's hand drifted toward her lips, reflexively, quietly, as if the motion itself were a summon to memory. She touched them with a kind of shy longing, as though her fingers sought to catch the echo of something that had once been hers, if only for a moment, if only as an illusion. She remembered how James had kissed her, how he would wrap his arms around her as though he could shield her from everything, and she remembered the softness of his kisses, the quiet, consoling heat of them, full of promises that had never found their way to his lips, promises she had always known were silence and shadow. She didn't know how she would endure another frame, another scene in which Elizabeth was the center of his attention, his mirror, his world. Their smiles, their gazes, the tenderness that belonged only to them, yet was denied to her, tore her apart in ways no longer knew how to justify, even to herself. She had lived through it once before. She had survived it once, but now she felt she would break if she tried again. She knew she had no right to what she felt, no right to jealousy, because it had all happened long ago. Life had changed, paths had taken their own turns, and she had no business returning to it. But the heart does not know of rights. The heart knows no boundaries. The heart always beats for the wrong people, in the wrong time, in places where it should remain silent. With a faint, nearly inaudible sigh, she pressed pause. The screen froze into an eternal moment of love that did not belong to her, preserving a smile that was not hers, a look that had never been meant for her. She wiped the tears from her eyes, as though by doing so, she might also erase what she had carried inside for years. Shame, pain, longing, the sense of having lost something that had never truly been hers to begin with. She stood, and the silence of the room was filled only by the soft whir of the video recorder as she pulled out the old tape and slid in a new one. With a single motion, she pressed play, and the recording began. Yet another frame, yet another proof of James once again too close to Elizabeth, brushing her cheek with that tender movement of his fingers that Anya had once known, gazing at her with a look that destroyed her. The same look she had conjured in her dreams for years, though it had never again been hers to receive. She let the recording play, again and again, allowing the scene to repeat its tenderness, while inside her chest a quiet storm grew. She knew he had been acting, and acting well. So well that at times it was impossible to tell reality from role. And yet, in those eyes, in that gaze, there was something too real, something that could never be reduced to a lie. She laid her head against the back of the armchair, while the light of dawn slowly crept in through the windows, gentle, indifferent, a reminder that life outside continued. But Anya did not care. She could stay there the whole night, lying still, watching the two of them laugh, touch, love, even if only on a screen, at a safe distance, far away from her. Anya was in love. She repeated it to herself like a prayer, like a curse, trying to find in those words both her justification and her punishment. In love with the wrong man, with his voice, with his words, with the way he looked at her when he thought no one was watching. His words still echoed in her mind, as if he was speaking them now, as if he was still there, as if he had never left. But he was not there. So, I suppose this is it, he spoke softly, almost in a whisper, as though the words themselves were heavy as stone, too heavy to rest on his tongue, slipping instead between them like molten lead, sinking straight into the emptiness that had long smoldered between them. Yes, it is, Anya replied, her voice trembling despite her desperate effort to steady it, to hold it upright with the last remnants of pride still standing within her. Each word scraped against her throat, a confession that did not wish to be spoken, but which, once released, carried the force of a verdict. The end of us. His words were not merely a sentence, but a cut, sharp and hushed, uttered with the torment of a man who was denying himself his own breath. Yes, she whispered, barely audible, as tears welled in her eyes, burning like shame, while her throat closed with the pain she wished to conceal, though the tears betrayed every weakness. But will we try again? I mean, they can't keep us apart forever, can they? Her words were tangled in hope and despair, in a quiet, almost childlike plea to find at least a trace of a way back, towards something that perhaps could have been saved, though she already knew, even then, that it was gone. He was silent for a long time, his gaze lowered, as though he feared finding in her eyes what he could not admit even to himself. Then he slowly, almost gently, shook his head, a tender gesture, yet deadly, for in its gentleness lay the cruelty. "We can't," he finally said, his voice not sounding as though he believed it, but carrying the firmness of a decision, one not born of indifference but of despair, of the attempt to shield them both from what might destroy them. Anya's heart shattered into countless fragments, each one bleeding, each one hurting on its own. Desperately, she searched his eyes for the faintest foothold, a final trace of hope. Just because we won't see each other as often, does that really mean we won't be all right? Anya, we can't go on like this, and you know it. His voice was a mixture of pain and steel, of restrained sorrow sharpened into a blade, a sentence that cut not because it wanted to, but because it had to. And perhaps that was the deepest truth of all, that sometimes the things we love most are the very things we must release, for it is not always what is spoken that wounds, but what must remain forever unsaid. They were two people being mercilessly torn apart by diverging paths, two strangers who had once shared breath and now stood on opposite shores, drifting further and further away without question, without choice. He went on into days filled with work and obligations, while she lived in silences, in time that no longer knew him. Their paths had already chosen for them, that they would never cross again. He would move forward, and she would, somehow, learn to breathe without him, even with lungs left half empty. After it all, Anya promised herself she would never again let his words, his voice, his presence wrap around her like a quiet fog and enslave her anew. And so she withdrew, slowly but resolutely, like a shadow retreating before the first traces of dawn. She cut off conversations, reduced communication to cold messages and distant emails, refusing every attempt he made to meet, greeting each knock with silence and excuses. At first, he tried to keep the thread alive, to find his way back to her despite his own words, but one by one, his attempts faded, until finally there was only silence, heavy, unmoving silence. That silence became the wall between them, between her and her sister, between her and her family. The moment everyone discovered their story, a story that should never have seen the light of day, Anya was left alone, separated from all, bearing her cross that no one else could lift. The tape went silent, and when she looked up, it felt as though an eternity had passed, though the clock's hands had barely moved. The sunlight creeping through the windows caught her unprepared, as if it had woken her from a nightmare, reminding her that a world still existed beyond the darkness she had woven for herself. She rose, sluggish, and made her way toward the bedroom, but as she passed the mirror, her eyes betrayed her, catching her own reflection. The woman who stared back was a stranger, with eyes swollen red from tears, hair disheveled, face hollowed and tired. She was broken, someone who had lost what was most precious and had never learned how to let it go. She lifted her hand, and brushed it across her cheek, as though she could wipe away the traces of grief. But in the reflection, nothing changed. She shed her robe and slipped beneath the covers, searching for solace in the warmth of the bed. She turned onto her side, back facing the light, as though she could deny the day, deny her thoughts, hold on to darkness as her only refuge. But each time she closed her eyes, the images returned, unyielding, relentless, haunting visions of their looks, their touches, their moments that had existed though they never should have. In that moment, as she struggled to chase away the unrest, she felt a familiar arm curled gently around her, the soft weight of a body pressing against hers, the warmth spilling down her back like a quiet comfort. She did not dare to turn, for she knew that if she looked, she would find in her daughter's eyes the question she could never answer. She did not want Kai to carry her burden, to be pulled into the whirlpool of a past that had long since begun to consume her. But when the little girl held her tighter, Anya exhaled softly, recognizing in that embrace what she had sought all her life, what the world had denied her: safety, belonging, and unconditional love. In that child's need to remain close lay the meaning of everything, woven into every small gesture, every hand held, every night's sleep in quiet togetherness. Kai was her light, her redemption, the child who had grown from the darkness and carried within her the strength to save her. Anya placed her hand over the delicate child's fingers that clasped her, holding that fragile warmth as though she was cradling her entire world in her palm. Kai slept peacefully, in the serenity Anya herself could never find. She pulled the blanket over her head, wanting to hide both from the light and from her thoughts, while her daughter's forehead rested against her back, steady, tender, like a silent vow that she would never be alone. And as the day slowly spilled its colors across the room, Anya finally closed her eyes and surrendered to sleep, the only place where the past could not fully reach her. By 9 o'clock in the morning, Anya and her daughter were already in the bookshop, each absorbed in her own little universe. Anya's steps carried her briskly between the shelves, each one mindful of the titles that needed sorting, the orders that had to be written down, and the lists of new arrivals demanding her attention. The little girl, blonde-haired and lively, had found a ball in the small room behind the shelves, and, the very next moment, dashed outside, her smile carrying all the lightness of childhood. It was the first day of the weekend, a day that for many meant rest, but for Anya, there had never been such a thing as retreat. She wanted the space of books to breathe, to echo with the rhythm of life, to never sink into a suffocating silence. She loved her work, at least she told herself so, insistently, almost stubbornly. Otherwise, the alternative was threatening and dreadful, that thick, cold fog of loneliness that seeped into her bones and turned into an unbearable weight. And so she pressed forward, day after day, as though every open book was yet another proof that she could endure. She unlocked the mailbox by the entrance, drew out a handful of envelopes, and smiled in passing at her daughter, who at that very moment was dribbling the ball across the pavement with grave determination. Her eyes skimmed quickly over the stack of bills, advertisements, and the old literary journals she still subscribed to, only for sentimental reasons. And then, almost theatrically, the postman appeared at the door with heavy steps, holding in his hands a bouquet so lavish that his eyes could scarcely be seen above its sea of flowers. "Miss Woodburg," he said, breathless, extending the gift as though it was something far more precious than a simple delivery. "Flowers have arrived for you." The card was separate, and I admit I accidentally opened it. There's no signature. Anya accepted the vase of blossoms, still bewildered, almost cautious before such sudden opulence. The bouquet was carefully chosen, filled with tender shades and varieties she loved, as though it had been selected by someone who knew exactly what would stir even her most hidden feelings. The card, gleaming with delicate golden traces, bore a single, simple line: "I hope your week went well." The handwriting was neat, deliberately neutral, a conscious effort to remain unrecognizable, and it was precisely that deliberate anonymity that gave the message its weight. The postman soon departed, leaving behind a fragrance that spread from the bouquet like someone's quiet presence lingering in the room. She sat at her desk and gazed at the flowers for a long time, as if they might speak, as if each petal could betray the secret of its sender. In her thoughts, almost unconsciously, she opened her email and added a brief postscript in her message to the manager in Leeds, less a piece of information than a confession she could not voice aloud. "I've just received a bouquet. It's beautiful. Its scent fills the entire room, as though someone I missed has just walked in, but I have no idea who it's from." The reply came quickly, cheerful and light, filled with that familiar warmth that often saved her when she felt lost. "That sounds exciting, Anya. Looks like you have a secret admirer. How romantic. Don't worry about the Popedal issue. I've sent someone to sort it out, and your packages will arrive soon." The new books came in at excellent prices, and I'm sure they'll sell out the moment I display them. I'll keep you updated, boss. "Thank you, G. That means a lot," she typed back briefly, yet with genuine gratitude, for every small gesture that helped her stay collected was more than welcome. Sorting new titles always had a nearly therapeutic effect on Anya. In the rhythm of arranging, in the weight and rustle of pages, she found a kind of harmony. There was something healing in it, as if each novel, each collection of stories, each essay was a small step toward her own recovery. In the moments when her palms wrapped around the covers of worlds yet unread, her thoughts refused to wander, and her heart, so used to being torn between past and present, found a steady rhythm. Boxes, stacked in the corner, waited to be opened. One of them, heavier than the rest, stood before her, sealed with tape that she cut with careful precision. She slid her hands beneath the cardboard and began to lift, feeling the sharp edges press into her skin. Her gaze, almost unconsciously, drifted once more toward the bouquet. It was as if the fragrance had grown stronger at that moment, as if it called to her with a soft, insistent voice, reminding her of a feeling she had not yet learned to name. She could not recognize the handwriting on the card. She tried to match it to a name, a face, a memory that would lead her to the answer, but in vain. The letters were unfamiliar, their lines cool and precise, as though they had been shaped deliberately to hide identity. She shook her head, attempting to scatter the thought that flickered at the edge of her mind, and focused on the task before her. The box awaited, and she had decided to empty it carefully, patiently, title by title, just as a heart heals slowly, without sudden cuts, in a rhythm only time can dictate. But then, as she tried to lift it, something happened that she could not explain. The box, if only for a moment, grew lighter, as though another hand had taken the weight along with hers. She flinched, convinced that fatigue was already deceiving her, that she was imagining what could not be real. And just then, when she nearly convinced herself it was only her weakness, she heard a voice, soft, familiar, near, the kind that slips into the space between breath and silence. "Allow me." She froze, her heart skipping a beat, then another, as if struggling to find the rhythm it had suddenly lost. The voice she heard was gentle, almost hushed, yet within it trembled something that could be danger or recognition, and it precisely made the ground sway beneath her feet. The game Fred Stevenson had always played came with no rules, no guidebook to explain how to enter or exit his world, and even less a way to escape without scars. It was a territory where anything was possible, where words and glances became weapons, and the heart could be lost as easily as in a wager that could never be withdrawn. And yet, here he was before her, real, almost unbearably calm, with that quiet presence that always made him stronger than anything he might say. He did not utter a single unnecessary word. He simply stepped closer and, as if it was the most natural thing in the world, took the heavy box from her hands. That unexpected touch was enough to steal her breath, as though someone had suddenly opened a window inside her chest and let the wind scatter everything she had so carefully hidden. She watched him lower the box onto the table and turn toward her, meeting her gaze, frozen somewhere between confusion and disbelief, so childlike in its clarity that she herself began to doubt her own sobriety. She blinked once, then again, searching for confirmation that this was reality and not some illusion her mind had conjured. The question rose up, raw and undeniable. What on earth was Fred Stevenson doing in her bookshop, and how had he found her? Yet before she could seek the answer in him, that inner voice spoke, familiar, quiet, and never fully silenced. Of course he was here. He was a policeman, or a detective. She was no longer certain, but always someone who knew how to uncover whatever he wished to uncover. A faint smile touched his face, just a trace, the same smile that once disarmed her in moments when he wished to remain unreadable. "I happen to be in this part of town, near your shop," he said evenly, a short, almost inaudible laugh following. One eyebrow arched, drawing that familiar crease on his forehead, a sign of the game he continued to play. "And naturally, I couldn't let you struggle with a box nearly as heavy as you are." A wave of unease stole her breath, and her thoughts flew to Kai, as though in that instant she needed to touch her, to reassure herself that she was safe. "Honestly, Fred," she murmured softly, her voice uncertain whether to greet him or dismiss him, while her eyes drifted to the shop window, as if searching beyond the passers-by and the morning light for an escape. "I won't even ask what sources you use to find out where I work. I have my ways," he replied curtly, and she rolled her eyes, those wide, blue eyes, like something remembered from a fairy tale. eyes that once knew him better than he knew himself. Their silence grew almost as loud as words, for both of them carried the weight of that old conversation they had never finished, the one that always returned, unspoken, between them. She could not tell whether Fred regretted anything he had once said or done, for there had been no explanations, no confessions between them. And yet it was clear, though he spoke no word, that within him still lingered a concern he could not hide, a concern that told her what had passed between them had not simply burned out. And so they stood, facing one another, their eyes concealing more than they revealed, allowing the years of unsaid words to speak for them instead. Outside, in the soft morning sun, Kai and Matilda faced each other, tossing the ball back and forth, indifferent to the world of adults, building their own silence, a silence that was both play and refuge. Fred, watching through the glass, shook his head quietly, and a smile touched his lips, a smile without brightness, without joy, more like a shard than an expression of happiness. It was the smile of a man who knew how to laugh only at the consequences of his own choices, never at life itself. A bitter smile, hollow, one that concealed more than it revealed. He said nothing. What could he possibly say? To apologize? To excuse it all as the madness of the mind, the chaos that Anya and Kai had stirred in him, their existence, their silence? Or to plead for forgetfulness? He knew all of it would be meaningless. A man must carry his own cross, must face his own choices. And Fred knew he had already pulled the ground from under himself. And if he could not find a way to stand again, he would collapse once more. "Well, good morning to you too," Anya said in a cold, sarcastic tone, without looking at him. "By all means, just walk in, no need to knock, or even announce yourself." Fred smiled faintly, inclining his head, his tone both jest and admission. Sarcastic detected, miss. Her gaze drifted back to the two girls, reassuring herself that they were safe, that nothing threatened their little world. Then she approached the box and began pulling out books one by one, carefully, as if handling fragile memories that could easily break. She said nothing more. Fred leaned against the table beside her, watching her in silence, like a man trying to solve a riddle he knew might remain unsolvable. He looked at the woman who was both his painful enigma and his deepest truth, confounding, yet utterly clear. She, clutching several books to her chest, felt her heart pounding beneath the covers, like a bird trapped in its own cage. When their eyes met, wordless, he seemed to seek answers and forgiveness, perhaps only permission to stay, while her eyes struggled to remain cold. Yet beneath the surface, warmth spilled from them, warmth she could not conceal. "Get off my desk," she said quietly, without raising her eyes. He did not move. "Excuse me," she repeated, sharper now, her voice cutting. "Did I stutter? Get off my desk, Stevenson." Fred ran a finger over his lips, biting at the corner, like a man struggling not to speak a sentence that might change everything. Her face, glowing with mounting anger, was achingly beautiful in its tension. "If you don't move right now, what will you do?" he interrupted softly, a half-smile hanging in the corner of his lips, his voice more plea than challenge. "Come on, tell me, Anya. What will you do?" "This is absolutely ridiculous," she hissed, emotions boiling beneath her skin like a spring torrent. That smile, that cursed smile of his, drove her mad. She hated that he alone knew how to shake her, for no one else had ever managed to unbalance her the way Fred Stevenson did. With sudden resolve, she moved toward the shelves, wanting to turn her back to him, to deny him her gaze, to escape his presence. But Fred, like a man convinced of his place, sank into her leather chair, leaning back with his hands behind his head, surrendering to the moment, serene in his defiance, even as time itself drained mercilessly against him. Knowing that nothing, neither words nor silence, would make him leave, Anya drew in a deep breath, set a few more books on the table, and, almost unwillingly, uttered a question that sounded more like a sigh than an invitation. "Would you like some coffee?" "I was wondering if you'd offer," he replied with a gentle smile, nodding. "Yes, I'd like that." She placed the books carefully back on the shelf, as if order in that small motion could restore at least a semblance of control, then disappeared through the narrow door that led into the shop's cramped back room, the little safe zone where she always sought shelter. Her heart was pounding hard, in steady, merciless waves, like a bell tolling through empty corridors, refusing to let her rest. How dare he? How dare he step into her place, into her peace, and find her here after everything? Hadn't she made it clear she wanted him nowhere near her? Hadn't she repeated it to herself, over and over, that there was no place for him within her walls, least of all near Kai? And yet here he was, and that bare fact alone was enough to shatter her breath. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady the storm rising in her chest. Her breathing grew short, shallow, almost painful, while her thoughts raced beyond her ability to rein them in. The coffee machine gave a low, familiar whine, then poured its hot stream into the last cup left on the shelf, the faded pink one, with its worn butterflies and little princess motif. Of course, she thought with bitter irony. Of course that one remained. Pink. That would be his. He would drink from it, just as he had always known how to take whatever was offered without question. When she returned to the shop, his face rose before her like a shadow from the past that had never ceased to follow her. Fred lifted his gaze as soon as he heard her steps, and in his eyes there was something she refused to name. Fragile hope, perhaps, or wistful longing, something steeped in the bitterness of what had long been lost. He loved her, and now he knew it. He no longer had excuses to run from his own confession. For years he had deceived himself, pretending it had been fleeting, a weakness, a moment's passion, a desire that could be erased. But it had not been. It had been her, in her silences, in her looks, in the way she grew angry, in the silence with which she answered. He loved her quietly, daily, relentlessly. And now, as she handed him the cup, that truth could no longer be hidden. "Sorry, it's the only one I had left," she said calmly, lying without the slightest pang of guilt. For that small falsehood was the least she could give him. Fred lowered his eyes to the cup, then smiled, softly, almost tenderly. "No problem. It's sweet." "Thank you, Anya. You're welcome," she answered, her voice scarcely more than a whisper. She took a book from the shelf, opened it at random, and began leafing through its pages, as though searching for shelter in another writer's sentences, as if trying to slip out of her own skin. Fred blew gently across the rim and sipped, the room filling with the scent of coffee and unspoken words, thick, heavy, and palpable. "It's lovely here," he said at last, and she found she had no strength to answer him right away. She glanced at him briefly, shyly, before her eyes fled again to the shelves, to the books that had witnessed her sleepless nights and quiet heartbreaks. The shop was dearer to her than her own thoughts, a sanctuary where she hid from everything she could not endure. "Thank you," she whispered at last, barely audible. Fred raised an eyebrow, with a smile that tried to soften the wall between them. "A pink cup with butterflies and a princess?" he asked, holding it up. "Was this Kai's?" A smile appeared on her lips, a smile that concealed more than it revealed. "It used to be. Now she's not interested in anything that isn't shaped like a football." Her voice wavered at the end, but she hid the weakness by lowering her gaze back to the book she was arranging. "A real wild-hearted girl," he said with a warmth that hurt her. The complete opposite of Matilda. Her hands kept moving mechanically, but her thoughts were trapped in the past, in memories she had tried for years to bury. She had not wanted this meeting. She had not summoned it, nor given him the slightest reason. Least of all did she want to see him here, in her refuge, beside their daughter, as though he had never left. And so silence remained her only shield. "Anya, she's beautiful," he said suddenly, softly, almost reverently. "From that day on, the football field, I haven't been able to erase that image from my mind." She gripped the book so tightly, the edge of the cover burned into her thumb. But the pain was welcome, for it was real, solid, unlike the turmoil tearing at her inside. "Why are you telling me this, Fred?" she whispered, defenseless, drained of strength. "Because that moment broke through every wall. I felt regret, the true, merciless kind, the kind that robs you of sleep. I knew I had lost something that could never be replaced." Her gaze slid along the shelves, but her eyes blurred, veiled with tears she could no longer hold back. "I didn't mean to make you cry," he said, his voice gentle, sincere. "If you want, I can leave." She wiped her face quickly, clinging to the last shreds of dignity. "What I want to know is, what was it in you that stirred such unrest?" Fred exhaled deeply, with the weight of a man who had finally decided to stop hiding from himself. "When I saw her, I realized I couldn't go on living like a ghost, an outsider, a shadow, or someone who keeps running. Not with her in the world. I don't blame you, you know. I don't want to blame you. But the day you left, you died for me. That was the day I stopped being a girl. That was the day I became a woman, a mother. I learned I no longer had the right to weakness, because there was already a life inside me that depended entirely on me. I became a mother long before she ever saw the light of day. And when I told you she was only mine, I meant it, because I bore her without you, raised her without you, taught her to love without you." Fred remained silent, for the words he longed to say withered beneath the weight of all he had lost. "Anya, this frightens me," he said at last, his voice almost a whisper. It frightens me because, for the first time, I know that I want to be her father." She lifted her gaze toward him, slowly, cautiously, and did not draw back when he stepped closer. "I've never been good at apologies," he confessed, his voice tinged with guilt. "But I'm sorry. For everything. For the way I left. For abandoning both of you. And more than anything, for betraying you." "It's too late," she said, though her voice was unsteady, full of fear and sorrow. He raised his hand and pressed his palm against her cheek. She did not retreat. "It's not too late," he whispered. "Don't, Fred, please. Don't make the same mistake again. Go back to Rosalie. That's your life." She didn't know. She couldn't know. How could he tell her that life no longer existed? That Rosalie had been gone for 2 years? That Matilda had been growing up without a mother ever since, and he without his rock? He wanted to confess, to shatter the walls, but the door suddenly swung open, and the girls rushed into the bookshop, bringing with them laughter and the wind in their hair. Anya instantly stepped back, donning the mask of a smile, moving toward them, while Fred turned away, feeling his heart tighten under the weight of all that had gone unsaid. Matilda's eyes were a mirror of both past and future at once, large and soft, hazel in color, carrying that quiet radiance which cuts deeper than words and leaves the one who beholds it breathless. In them, Anya saw clearly for the first time what she had tried so long to suppress and now could no longer deny. She looked upon 2 faces, 2 half-sisters, 2 lives that had sprung from the same root, yet grown on opposite sides of time. Her daughter, and the daughter of the man who had once shattered her world, now standing there as if he was trying to gather its broken pieces back into his hands, piecing them together, fragile shard by fragile shard. All that Fred had carried inside him now poured into a single, quiet voice within, the voice of a man who might have spoken, or might have remained silent. "I don't know why I betrayed you that day. No, I do know. I'm only ashamed to admit that the reason was so petty, so small, so pitiful. If it means anything to you, my life since then has been chaos, a dark room without windows, where I stumbled blind, crashing into the walls I built myself. But none of that changes the fact that I betrayed you, Anya. You gave me love, trust, and a child, and I drove a knife into your back. Everything you ever did for me, everything you were, I cast it to the wind for a single moment of weakness. And perhaps the only thing I can say to you now, honest, bare, stripped to the bone, is that I am sorry. Sorry in ways you will never truly know." Fred blinked, twice, like a man afraid that his thoughts had slipped out into the open, as though he had spoken aloud what he had meant to bury deep within. And then he saw her, Anya, standing there among the shelves that smelled of childhood, of memories and forgotten dreams, a quiet presence enveloping him from within, without noise, without sudden movements, with nothing but the force of her being. In that moment, it seemed to him that he was looking at an angel, not a mythical creature of golden light, but a mortal miracle that life, on rare occasions, gives undeservedly to a man. She was silent and still, yet strong in her gentleness, and he closed his eyes for a few seconds, counted to 10, praying that the vision would not vanish when he opened them again. And when he did, she was still there. Then he knew that he never wanted to lose her again, that fate had broken him enough times already, and that he would not survive if she was taken from him once more. Matilda, unknowingly, had become the bridge between them. Her eyes, full of curiosity, looked at Anya with a mixture of shyness and trust, like a child finding her place without understanding why. Fred stood beside them, present yet quiet, careful not to disturb the moment. Anya leaned closer, lowering herself to the girl's height, and spoke words that sounded like a whisper of mist at dawn, words imbued with the warmth of home and the softness children always recognize. "Welcome to my bookshop, Matilda." As she spoke, her hands moved in sign language, translating every word for Kai, who bore witness to the scene with a quiet gaze. "Do you like to read?" she asked, and the girl nodded. "I do." Anya inched closer still, lowering herself onto her knees, face to face with the child, whose golden curls lit up the room, like sunlight piercing through dusty windows. "And what do you like to read?" she asked, her voice carrying both warmth and certainty. "Fairy tales," Matilda replied, and in that instant the world was simple and pure, distilled to stories and dreams. "Ah, fairy tales. The whole world is hidden within them," Anya said softly, and touched her hand gently, as if protecting it from breaking. Fred watched the scene, his eyes fixed on his daughter as she opened her heart to the woman he had once broken, and felt his throat tighten. Kai observed it all in silence, her smile tucked away in her eyes, her gaze reflecting an understanding far older than her years. "Come with me," Anya said, extending her hand. Matilda took it, shyly yet without hesitation, as though she had already recognized safety in that touch. Anya led her to a shelf where books stood in neat rows, and among them she stopped at one, large, with hard covers, adorned with golden letters, a treasury of fairy tales. "Do you like this one?" she asked, her smile gentle, warm, the smile of a woman who knew how to give not just a book, but a sense of belonging. The girl nodded, delighted, as if she had found a treasure. "This is for you, sweetheart." Fred watched the scene unfold, leaving through the years in his mind. His daughter, who had too often known only silence and loss, now held a book as if she was cradling a heart in her hands. "Thank you," she whispered softly. "You're welcome," Anya replied, and in her voice there was something that made even Fred believe there might be a way to mend at least a fragment of the past. Matilda turned toward him. "Will you read me the fairy tales, Daddy?" she asked, and those words struck him deeper than anything ever had. He knelt beside her, touching her chin gently, as though he feared she might shatter if he was too rough. "Of course I will. I'll always read to you, always," he said. And he knew that within those words, he was promising far more than fairy tales alone. His gaze then found Anya's, and in it lived gratitude, but also regret, and the quiet flame of a longing that had burned for years. Everything he could not put into words resided in that single moment, in the eyes that reflected his own wounds back at him. He remembered the day he first saw her, back at the university, walking through the hallway like a woman who already knew the path ahead. He had been young and uncertain, while she was a force, confident, self-possessed, and unshakable. His own insecurity had been nothing but a shadow beside her son. And when she consumed him, when she turned anger into touch, when she spoke with her eyes the things she refused to say aloud, he had been powerless to resist. It hadn't been a fleeting weakness, but a primal force, separating what mattered from what did not. He had always been torn between others and himself, between fear and desire. But Anya had been his root, the ground beneath his feet, the voice that did not tremble even when everything else fell away. From that night in her dorm room, when they had found themselves far from the world and all its noise, he had known, though he would not admit it to himself, that she was shaping him. At first, he watched her cautiously, just to know what to expect. But soon, he could no longer stop, for every nuance of hers drew him deeper. She became his obsession, slowly and inexorably, like a flame that does not die, but feeds on everything in its path. He had never been sure of anything except his own uncertainty, especially when he saw her leaving the building and crossing the street to the man who waited for her brother-in-law, arms wide open, always ready to embrace her as if she had always belonged to him. That sight, those arms closing around her, the way she permitted his nearness, awoke in Fred something dark, unformed, raw, and aching, something that throbbed like an unhealed wound, and its name was jealousy. And now, years later, the memory of that image alone was enough to stir unease in his body, to make his heart stumble as though fleeing from its own thoughts. Perhaps she, from her side, had tried to read him too, to test the silent walls he built, to find in that silence the answer to a question she never spoke. Perhaps she had doubted as well, had studied him from afar, just as he had studied her movements. But he never knew. He had no right to ask, nor had he planned to, until the day she finally looked at him differently, without disdain, without indifference. She looked at him, for the first time, as a man without barriers, without masks, and in that one glance, something inside him broke and shifted forever. He became hers, wholly and irrevocably, though he did not yet know how to name it. Only as the days passed did he begin to grasp the weight of that moment, that he no longer belonged to himself, nor to Rosalie. His belonging had shifted, slowly but inevitably, toward Anya. She had fascinated him, not only with her presence, but with her inexplicable strength, that wild, raw energy that both frightened him and to which he surrendered without resistance. She was brave, unmasked, painfully honest, never striving to please anyone, and in that lay her allure. He had not known how to say no to her, had never been able to silence her, nor strong enough to tame her. Every outburst, every truth, no matter how much it hurt him, became the only truth he could accept, because in her honesty there was something that freed him. And as she stripped layers from her own skin, he, for the first time in his life, felt seen. Her behavior had puzzled him at first, seemed like a world without rules. But the longer he stayed beside her, the more he realized that this untamed honesty was the only normalcy he could endure. She spoke what she felt, no matter the cost, and in that he recognized freedom. Wasn't truth, however brutal, the only path worth walking? He had tried to justify himself, to convince his mind that betraying Rosalie had been just a moment of weakness. But deep down, he knew it hadn't been weakness, but a choice. He could not run from what he felt. The more he watched her, the deeper he sank into desire. But it wasn't desire only for her body. It was for her strength, her freedom, for that stripped-down identity she bore without shame. He wanted her energy, her defiant truth. He wanted to become what she was. In her approval, he sought validation of his own existence, like a child searching for safety and recognition in an adult's eyes. He would have followed her anywhere, blindly, without questions, without return. And every time she looked at him with her half-lowered lids and that half-smile, more a challenge than a smile, he felt his whole world collapse until only she remained. That look both destroyed and remade him. For even while he still wore a wedding ring, even while he technically belonged to another, in her gaze, he was already hers. In Anya, he found something he could not find in himself: identity. He did not need to build it, or pretend, or shape it. Beside her, he simply existed. Or so he believed. But everything that grew and took shape within him, everything that carried him in a direction he could not name, came with its price. And that price was the child, who had grown up far from him. Kai stood near the bookshelf, watching her mother speak with Matilda. The same hands that had once belonged only to her, that had carried her and explained the world to her, were now reaching toward another child, moving in the rhythm of signs she could not understand. Kai did not hear, she could not hear, but in her chest she felt a thunder louder than any word. It was anger, raw and nameless, pulsing within her like an avalanche, far too vast for a child of her age to carry, let alone to express. Her mother, her only anchor, was now turned toward someone else, and Kai was left on the outside, helpless, overwhelmed at the sense that something was being stolen from her. She did not know whether it hurt more that she could not understand their language, or that her jealousy was so fierce it felt as though it was suffocating her. Because Matilda had something she did not. She had a father. Kai longed for the same, longed for that anchor, that figure, longed to have someone to belong to, someone she could embrace and call her own. Instead, she had only her mother, and that emptiness, that lack, hurt like a wound that never healed. So she clenched the ball with all her strength, turned away, and slammed the door of the back room, so hard that the walls trembled with the weight of her pain. Fred and Anya exchanged a look, and the silence between them was heavier than any sentence could have been. There was no need to break it because everything was already there in that single gaze. Fred then nodded softly, like a man surrendering to his own decision, and walked away, feeling his heart pound as though it was trying to escape. Every step was heavy and every breath felt like penance. When he entered the room, he saw Kai sitting on the bed, turned away from him. She did not look at him, but she didn't need to. She felt his presence without words. He crouched down slowly in front of her, placing his hands on the mattress, his fingers whitening from the tension. He was more nervous than he had ever been in his life. Before him sat his own child, so close and yet unreachable, as though a whole world stood between them. He longed to gather her in his arms, to pull her close and whisper that he was here, that he would never leave her again. But he didn't dare. She was already wounded, and he was the last person who had any right to wound her further. At last, Kai lifted her gaze to him. Her eyes, two pale circles of the ocean, held something far too heavy for a child. Unspoken sorrow, frustration, and a question pressing at her throat with no path to escape. He looked at that small face, at once so familiar and unfamiliar, and felt his heart constrict with the impossibility of explaining, of speaking, of mending. His child who did not know she was his. He raised his hand and gave a small wave, hesitant and uncertain, like a man standing before his own child for the first time, unsure of the language with which to reach her. And that was the truth. He did not know sign language, did not know the bridge that could carry him across to her. All he had left was that clumsy gesture and the aching desire to know her, to understand her, to tell her, even in silence, that he belonged to her as much as he had ever belonged to Anya. He bit his lower lip and tried to smile, more for himself than for her, a smile too fragile to pierce the wall of silence, trembling faintly on his lips like the shadow of a forgotten joy. He pointed to his mouth, grasping at the last strand of hope, the small miracle that might still be possible. And then, nearly breathless, in a hoarse whisper that burned his throat with bitterness, he asked, "Can you read my lips?" Kai nodded, barely, almost imperceptibly, as though she herself feared the truth that gesture carried. Then, as if desperate to drive out what tore at her from within, she kicked the ball away, sharp and furious, as though that sudden movement could rid her of the bitterness and pain swelling in her chest. In that instant, Fred realized what he had always known but had never been able to accept, that this was far harder than all the rehearsals in his mind, harder than all those imagined conversations he had held alone at night, harder than all the pictures he had tried to build as a shelter against reality. "Are you all right?" he asked slowly, cautiously, his finger trembling as he pointed toward her chest, brushing against the fabric of her sweater so lightly it was barely a touch, approaching something sacred, something that could not be seized, only earned through patience and suffering. Kai lowered her gaze, and her very being thundered before his eyes. Her body spoke, her shaking shoulders, her averted look. She was not all right, and he knew it. Yet in that muffled language of silence, in that wordless speech, he read a truth that wounded him more deeply than if she had spoken rejection aloud. Uncertain, careful, like a man afraid to break what was already fragile, Fred slid his hands along her sleeves. His hands, so often cold and empty, now sought to become shelter, to be her refuge, her safety, her home. And still, he did not dare embrace her, for in his heart there lived the fear that his arms might shatter her even more, though she already stood before him so vulnerable in her quiet pain. She was his blood, yet she did not belong to him, and perhaps she never would. His eyes clung to every movement, every line of her face, searching for a trace of recognition, as if somewhere, in the depths of her gaze, he might find the reflection that would confirm she knew who he was. Had Anya ever told her the truth? Had she ever seen his picture in some old box, tucked away in a drawer among memories, waiting to be discovered? Or was he to her nothing more than another stranger, another adult who wanted something from her, another face intruding upon her world? He cupped her face in his hands carefully, as though holding porcelain that could crumble beneath the weight of a breath. With his fingers he traced the warmth of her cheek, flushed and soft, the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and the saddest. His heart tore apart as he whispered, his voice more a prayer than words. "Oh dear, don't cry, please, please." But she could not hear him. In her eyes shimmered tears, thick and heavy, the kind that do not fall easily, but flood the soul and burn it from within. To her, he was nothing but an outline, the shadow of a man who had come too late. In her mind, the demand was crystal clear. "I don't want you here, I want Mama." Her hands began to speak in a language he did not understand. She clapped her palms together, sharp and sudden, then threw signs he couldn't read but felt to the bone. Each gesture struck him harder than a slap, cutting him open where every weakness lay exposed. He didn't know how to interpret them, but he knew how to feel them. "I don't want you. I want my Mama." Kai stomped her feet against the floor, her arm thrust toward the door in a motion no one could mistake. "Go." Fred shook his head, too broken to form words. His heart, already shattered once, split apart again. He couldn't leave, not now, not when she was finally in front of him. But her despair swelled, her movements growing harsh, frantic, desperate, as though she wanted to cast him out of her world. And then, when tears at last streamed down her cheeks in painful torrents, when she hurled her glasses to the ground and cried out with her hands, words he could not read, but understood with searing clarity, Fred, guided by an instinct older than reason, lifted his daughter into his arms. He held her close, fierce yet tender, as if trying to return her to the womb of time itself, to the safety that had been forever lost. He held her tight, unyielding, even as she thrashed and fought with her legs and fists. She did not know how to receive an embrace from someone else, other than her mother. She did not know what it meant to be loved to the point of never being let go, but he refused to relent. Slowly, her legs gave way, her arms fell, her head sank onto his shoulder, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed as though she surrendered to that fragile captivity of love. Fred walked with her, his steps dreamlike, as his heart thundered with a rhythm of pain and devotion. His hand slid down her back, then to the nape of her neck, his fingers tangling in her hair, as though shielding her from the world, from the past, from his own failures. "Daddy's here," he whispered, voice cracked and trembling yet laced with resolve. "Daddy will never let you go again. Never." He prayed those words might find their way through the walls, carving a place deep inside her where love could still take root. And she wept without a sound, her grief too vast to be carried in a cry. He swallowed knot after knot in his throat, desperate yet steadfast, for the first time in his life, truly being her father, not in shadows of the past, but here, in presence, in helplessness, in silence that screamed. He kissed her forehead, that small, warm place, scented with the years he had missed, with the childhood he had never witnessed, and buried his face in her hair as though he could hold every shiver, every trace of her, and bind the time that had already slipped beyond his reach. And while Kai sobbed softly, she began to quiet, not because the pain had vanished, but because for the first time she did not have to endure it alone. In that embrace, imperfect, aching, stubborn, there was something resembling what Matilda had: arms that did not let go, eyes that spoke what words could not. Fred was there, perhaps too late, but at last he was there. In the other room, Anya turned the pages of a large, fairy tale book, reading aloud to Matilda, her voice wrapping the story in warmth, while the girl traced the illustrations with delicate, thoughtful fingers. Yet Anya's heart was not entirely in the story. A part of her was taut, listening for the muffled sobs drifting from the other room, a sound thin but sharp as glass slicing into flesh. Every fiber of her longed to rise, to run, to scoop Kai into her arms and lay the whole world at her feet, if only to bring back her smile. But she stayed seated. She had to. She knew this was a moment that belonged to him, to Fred, and that only now, as fragile walls collapsed and as Kai stood open and raw, allowing the world, if only for a heartbeat, to draw near, he had to be the one to hold her. The door creaked, and Anya turned instinctively. Fred stood in the doorway. The sight of him was not only the presence of a man, but the return of an entire chapter of her life she had thought closed, now opening again before her. She laid her hand gently on Matilda's hair, stroked it once, and rose carefully, as if any sudden movement might shatter the fragile balance suspended in the air. Kai sat on the edge of the bed, head bowed, hands clasped in her lap. The dry traces of tears marked her cheeks with a redness that testified to the storm just calmed. Her soft sobs still lingered in the room, not a sound, but as the echo of pain retreating, though not gone. "What happened?" Anya asked, her voice gentle, tender yet threaded with unease, as though fearing the answer, as though she sensed within it a truth that might change everything. Fred stood like a man carrying the weight of the world in his chest. "I wish I knew sign language," he said, each word carrying both confession and defeat. She was angry at the misunderstanding, at me, at everything I hadn't been for her, at the emptiness I left behind. I think she wanted me gone, wanted to push me away. But I couldn't. I couldn't leave her like that, not when I saw her so lost, so vulnerable, not when she cried, and I, for the first time in my life, knew she was my child. His words hung heavy in the air, yet within them flickered a tender spark that pierced the layers of guilt. Their eyes met, and then glanced toward Kai, who was timidly wiping her tears with her palms, as though ashamed to let her pain be seen. In the end, Fred's voice grew hoarse. "She let me hold her. Did she? Truly?" Anya's voice barely emerged, fragile as glass, that might shatter under the slightest pressure, trembling with a hope she feared to release too soon. "Yes," Fred nodded, and in that nod there was both admission and regret. He looked at her long and deep, as though searching in her eyes for something he had once lost, something still missing for him to be able to breathe fully. "Anya, thank you." "For what?" she asked softly, her eyes wide open, yet tired and wounded, as if they no longer had the strength to believe in anything. "For not throwing me out. You have every right to. Every right. I deserve your contempt." His voice faltered, and each word fell like a stone. "I know how you feel." Anya's smile was bitter, a shadow of the warmth she once carried. "Do you really think you know?" "I do," he said, and in that "I do" lay more defeat than in all the years of silence that had come before. "I know you hate me, that I disgust you, that the sight of me makes you sick, and I deserve all of it. But thank you for still allowing me to be near her." "She is mine," Anya whispered, and in that single sentence lived both love and pain, possession and fear, the terror that what had been her only constant might be taken away. "Ours," he corrected softly, and as he spoke the word, his hand brushed her cheek, gently, almost fearfully. Anya turned her head aside, as if her skin still remembered old wounds, as if her body recalled the pain before her heart could even name it. "Can we stay in touch, please?" His voice was quiet, but filled with a hope that resisted all he knew he had already lost. Anya remained silent, but inside, she carried the knowledge that she could never live with the guilt of denying him the right to his child. No matter how much bitterness still lived in her, she knew Kai had the right to know who Fred was, to feel his presence, at least as a shadow, returning after long absence. But Fred, she doesn't know, she said at last, her gaze dropping, as though seeking strength from the ground beneath them. I know she doesn't, he answered calmly, as if he had been carrying that pain for years. Then how? She began, but he interrupted gently, with the tone of someone no longer asking for a miracle, but for a chance. I'm not asking for a miracle, just a little time, to show her I'm here, to stay, to earn her trust. For a moment she closed her eyes, as if she needed to quiet every voice within her so her heart could speak. You know, she said softly, sometimes you must find the courage to do what you know is right. Better that than running, pretending nothing exists while your conscience screams, roars and tears you apart inside. I know, he said again, but Anya shook her head. No, you don't. Because for me, there was never a question. From the moment I knew she was inside me, I knew she would stay. She was as much yours as she was mine. And you left. Fred had no answer. He was silent, and in that silence was a void no word could ever fill. Anya turned towards the table, picked up a pen and a piece of paper, and her hands trembling as she wrote. Fred watched her, aware that he was looking at something he had once lost and secretly longed for all his life. He breathed in her scent, summoning images of long-ago evenings in the dorm, candles flickering, hands trembling then, with the thrill of creation, and now with the strain of survival. He remembered the woman who once gave birth to art, and now, in her hands, he saw the effort simply to endure. And it broke him, because in her fragility, he found strength, the very strength that, despite everything, made him fall in love all over again. When she handed him the small slip of paper, her fingers brushed his for the briefest instant, and that touch, fleeting yet real, surged through him like lightning. This is my number, she said softly, almost in a whisper, as if the words could barely carry themselves. Thank you, he whispered back, but she had already withdrawn her hand and turned to Kai, who stood half hidden behind her, as though seeking shelter from the world. Anya laid her palm gently on the girl's shoulder, with a tenderness that seemed to fill the very air, then turned towards Matilda. Matilda, would you like to visit us again one day? She asked, in a voice soft and warm, but with eyes shimmering with unease. You could play with Kai. Maybe you'll become friends. Fred watched the scene. 2 little girls, and the woman opening a door to their future. Something tightened inside him, something beyond naming. He knew in that moment that words would never be enough to thank her, to make amends and to restore. And yet within him, he kept repeating, Anya, how can I ever give you all that you deserve? Matilda nodded shyly, her cheeks flushed, and in that timid gesture lay the weight of a small soul that had learned too early to carry too much. Then it's settled, Anya said, kissing Kai on the crown of her head, motherly, tender, with a love powerful enough to heal even what had never been spoken. And in that instant, Kai felt something new, soft and quiet, something she could not name, but which bloomed in her heart like the first flower after a long winter. Fred lowered himself to his knees before Kai and looked at her silently and reverently. This time, when his hand brushed her cheek, she did not pull away. She stayed, and the touch soothed her. Little Anya, he whispered, his eyes wet. Hardly, Anya answered, barely holding back tears. It's clear she doesn't look like me, except for her eyes. Her eyes are blue, just like mine. Fred only gazed, with a smile rising despite the ache. My child, he thought. My child who breathes, who exists, who looks exactly like me and who is here. At the doorway he stopped, looked back one last time. I'll call you. Anya nodded, then whispered softly, I know you will. And she did not know whether the pounding of her heart was a sign of what was right or the warning of a new mistake. Kai ran to the window, pressed her palms against the glass, and watched after them. Anya joined her quietly, standing close behind, and their gazes merged on the same point, the horizon, which suddenly seemed nearer and brighter. And then Anya felt the painful truth. Kai had already begun to cling to him, and it frightened her more than it consoled. For where there is hope, there is also risk and fear and pain. Yet hope had not vanished. It had begun to bloom quietly and gently, like spring arriving without announcement. Kai turned slowly, as though even the movement itself was part of the question she was about to ask, and lifted her gaze to her mother. Her face was shadowed by thought, and her wide eyes carried a gravity far beyond her years. Her palms rose gently, without haste, in the rhythm of the language that was her truest voice. Her fingers, steady and precise, shaped a sentence in the air, and the gestures, silent though they were, struck like a blow to the heart. Will he come back? The question, asked in silence, echoed more powerfully than if it had been spoken aloud. Anya watched her daughter's hands, that fragile dance of thought and emotion between them, and felt her heart tighten with each motion, with each form that Kai's fingers released into the space between them. She lowered her eyes, searching for steadiness in the shadows on the floor, as though the beams of light might shape a truth she herself did not know. Then, with the same quiet calm, she replied in gestures of her own. "I don't know, but he said he would." The girl paused, her eyes absorbing her mother's answer, as if she wanted to sink into it until every shade of meaning was hers. Only after a few moments did she raise her hands again, slowly, carefully, almost shyly, to ask, "Was he telling the truth, Mama?" Anya nodded, wordless, for no spoken phrase could bear such weight. Yet within herself, she thought firmly that he had sounded like a man who had left behind the road of running, a man who had perhaps, for the first time, chosen to stay. Kai turned quietly away, folding her palms against her chest, as if holding a fragile secret, and walked toward the little room in the bookshop, leaving behind a silence that spoke louder than any conversation. The door closed without a sound, and that hush became a mirror of their closeness. Anya remained alone, immersed in the sense of mourning and the shadows of a conversation that had ended too soon, yet carried the force of something that could move mountains. Sunlight poured through the window and fell upon the empty leather chair opposite her, the very one where the man had sat, whose presence already felt like a dream she had forgotten to hold on to. She leaned over the table, slowly, without haste, as if not to disturb the fragile memory still clinging to her. In her chest stirred something difficult to name, a vague amalgam of pain and hope, of fear and longing, like pain tinged with hope and hope tinged with fear, a circle without beginning or end. Her fingers rested on the chair's backrest, and in that simple gesture, she felt as though she was reaching for a trace of his warmth, as if the wood might still hold the breath of his presence. His face flickered before her eyes, not as it once had been, but older, wearier, etched with years. Yet within that weariness was a gentleness she had not dared to imagine she would find again. His voice had grown deeper, yet familiar, colored with the same tones from which she had once drawn comfort. And in his eyes, she had seen what had long since dried up within her. Tenderness, that quiet nearness which is not built of words, but of glances. She tilted her head back, closed her eyes, and remained without tears. Tears would have been too simple, too pure. What she felt was more complex, heavier, and deeper. Then the phone rang. The sound startled her chest into a leap, not of fear, but of something close to anticipation. She looked at it, but did not rise at once. She held on to the moment between sound and movement, that single heartbeat in which everything is still possible before the world decides its course. She knew that by answering, something within her would give way, that a current would begin which could no longer be stopped. Yet she went to it, cautiously, and pressed the button. The voice on the other end was quiet, recognizable, but now steadier and calmer, as though the man who spoke no longer wavered. "I forgot to tell you." He paused, then continued. "She walks like you. Her steps are gentle, as if she doesn't want to disturb the world." The word struck her more deeply than she expected, like a blow to a place she thought long dead. She closed her eyes, held her breath, and felt her body react faster than her mind. It was a touch without a hand, an embrace from afar, a presence carried through wires, yet no less real. "Do you have time tonight?" His voice was soft, yet clear enough to carry promise. "Just to talk, maybe share tea, maybe sit in silence together. Just to see you and her, to be there." Her lips moved, though no sound emerged at first. A wave coursed through her, not from fear, but from the weight of words locked away for too long. Then, barely audible, she whispered, "I do." Silence followed, but it was not empty. It was full, weighted with meaning, the silence that belongs to two people standing at the edge of something unnamed. Perhaps a beginning, perhaps an end, perhaps only an evening they would carry in memory for a long time. "Anya, may I have your address?" he asked, cautiously, almost fearfully. If it's not too much." She hesitated, a lump rising in her throat, her heart caught between retreat and step forward. She knew an address was not just letters and numbers. It was an invitation, the opening of a door, the admission that he might enter her chaos and sit beside her silence. She drew a breath, and in a voice barely above a whisper, said, Write this down." Then she gave him the address of the house outside town, carefully, almost disbelieving that she was truly doing it. "Thank you," he said simply. "Don't thank me." "Not yet," she answered, not with bitterness, but with a sorrow that foreshadowed the weight of all that was yet to come, as though she knew gratitude only comes after trials. She ended the call and lingered for a moment with the phone in her hands, her fingers resting on the screen, as though searching for an extension of touch. Then she laid it gently on the table and closed her eyes. In her chest, she felt a fire burning, a stillness before the storm, and a silence in which the whole future gathered itself into a single moment that had not yet decided what it would become. The street in front of Anya's house lay empty, wrapped in that quiet tension that follows a storm no one has witnessed, yet everyone can feel, in the scent of wet earth, in the stillness of the air, and in the way silence seems to expand, settling into every corner. Everything appeared frozen, not because life had fled, but because anticipation has the strange power to imprison even time itself, turning it into a silent witness of what is inevitable. The wind drifted through the treetops from time to time, stirring the leaves that rolled down the pavement, each gust like a sigh, like a memory refusing to be forgotten, returning for just a moment. Inside, the house was calm. Kai was asleep, lost in a dream that still belonged to a weightless world, her face serene and pure, like a blank page waiting to receive its first words. Her small hands rested beside her body, relaxed, without the faintest sign of tension, and her hair spilled softly across the pillow. Her sleep was not empty, for children never sleep in emptiness. Their dreams are full of unspoken things adults have long forgotten how to see. And Anya, in her quiet watch, understood what Kai could not yet say, the inner world her daughter revealed through every breath and every small motion. Anya stood by the window, sunk deep into thought, wrapped in a silence that spoke louder than words ever could. She wore a dark blue knitted dress, one she rarely chose, not because it was unflattering or plain, but because it was honest, the kind of clothing that brings a person closer to their own skin, to the truth of themselves. Her hands were clasped just below her chest, as if holding herself from within, and her palms were damp with invisible unease. Something beat too quickly in her chest, and every thought was tangled. Fear, shame, and longing swirled together in a pulse she couldn't quiet. Just when she began to believe she had been mistaken, that he would not come, she heard the distant hum of an engine. A police car appeared at the end of the street, moving slowly, almost timidly, as though it feared disturbing the fragile peace of the night. Its lights briefly illuminated the window before fading, and the vehicle came to a halt in front of her house. The door opened, and he stepped out. Fred. Tall, composed, deliberate, his uniform making him look as though he wore armor, though not the armor of a soldier. It was the armor of a man who has learned to protect himself from his own wounds. His steps were slow, careful, as if he knew that each one carried the weight of years lost. When she saw him, Anya's breath caught in her chest. The past suddenly demanded its place in the present, stealing the air from her lungs. She had told herself she was ready, that time had hardened her and made her stronger. But the moment he drew near, her heart betrayed her by beating too fast, not out of fear, but because of a truth she had never stopped feeling, a truth she had spent years trying to bury. She opened the door before he could knock. They stood face to face, two people divided by time, still bound by what was left unspoken. The tension between them was thick and tangible, like a string pulled so tight it could snap, yet didn't. "I didn't know if I should come, like this," he said softly, his voice carrying weariness, regret, and more vulnerability than pride. In those few words, she heard the tone of a man arriving for the first time with nothing to defend himself. Anya studied him for a long time. There was neither forgiveness nor reproach in her eyes, only exhaustion, the kind that belongs to a woman who has learned to be silent when she most wanted to scream. "You're late, Fred. Not just tonight. You're years too late." Her words fell quietly but heavy, and he lowered his gaze, nodding without excuse, like someone who knows he has lost the right to offer one. "But you still allowed me to come," he said after a pause quietly, uncertainly, almost like a boy. "I did," she answered without hesitation, "because it's the first time you came without an excuse." She turned and left the door open. She didn't need to tell him to enter. The invitation was in the gesture itself. He knew the doorway was both an entry and a threshold. If he crossed it, he would have to face everything waiting inside. Fred stepped into the house cautiously, silently, like a man entering a space that might once have been his, but never truly was. He stopped at the edge of the living room, his eyes moving across the remnants of a life he had missed. Children's drawings taped to the mirror, books neatly stacked on the shelf, tiny socks by the couch. Every detail was proof of what he had lost before he even understood its worth. "She's asleep?" he asked quietly. "She is," Anya replied softly. "It's been too much for her today." He nodded, silent, and then, more to himself than to her, murmured, "I still think about how she uses sign language." His words weren't seeking explanation. They were an admission of absence. "Yes," Anya said. "Sometimes she tries to form words, but her world is clearer through her hands than through her voice." A shadow crossed his face, the kind of sorrow known only to those who stand on the outside, watching the life that could have been theirs. "I'm not afraid of that world," he said slowly. "I'm afraid I won't know how to belong to it." Anya's gaze was steady, gentle but firm, stripped of bitterness. "You didn't have to know everything," she said quietly. "You only had to stay." They fell into silence again, each alone with their thoughts. And then, softly, as though offering him refuge from his own, she asked, "Would you like some tea?" He looked up, uncertain. "If you have the time." There was no smile on her face, but something in her voice held warmth. "Tonight, I do." She turned toward the kitchen without looking back. She knew he was there, following each of her movements, like someone walking a familiar path that no longer belonged to them. The water began to hum softly on the stove, and her movements were calm, though her shoulders still carried their quiet tension. Fred stood in the living room, too uncertain to sit, an observer rather than a guest. "Mint tea?" she asked gently. "Sounds like something I haven't had in years," he replied. A faint smile flickered across her face, vanishing before it could settle. "I didn't expect you to come," she said finally, her voice sounding more like a confession to herself than a statement to him. "I didn't know if I was allowed to," he answered. Silence fell again, heavy and alive, like a bridge suspended between two shores, neither sure if it could bear the weight of crossing. "Why now?" she asked without turning around. "Because I finally stopped being paralyzed by what if. Because I couldn't stand hiding behind duty anymore. Because," he hesitated, "I saw Kai." At the mention of that name, she turned and met his eyes. In her gaze were all the years she had spent alone, every unspoken sentence, every burden she had carried without anyone to share it. Yet beneath it all, deep in her eyes, lay a wound that had never been given permission to bleed aloud. "And what did you see?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Fred hesitated, as though searching for words in the dark corridors of his own conscience, where every echo was heavy with guilt. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, breaking under the weight of memory. "I saw a child who speaks with her hands, and yet says everything with her heart. I saw your strength in her, and my own failure." The words hung between them, unbearably heavy, not as a plea for forgiveness, but a confession that stripped bare everything that had always been there. Anya exhaled deeply, not as someone ready to forgive, but as someone who'd carried the burden of silence too long and could no longer keep it contained. She stood by the kitchen counter, between him and the dim evening light, like a line dividing the returning past from the uncertain present. "Do you know how many times I wanted to call you?" she asked, her eyes fixed on the cracks in the wooden table. "Not because I didn't know what to do, but because I wanted to share it. The first time she signed Mama. Her first day of school. The fevers that kept me awake at night. The silence only a mother learns to understand." Fred leaned against the doorframe, his eyes glassy and hard, like something fragile that might shatter at a touch. He didn't cry. He didn't know how, but he didn't need to. His pain was drawn across every line of his face, in every effort to remain upright while her words cut through him. "I didn't have the courage," he admitted quietly, almost in shame. "I left so I wouldn't cause more harm, and by leaving, I caused exactly that." Anya poured the water into 2 cups, slowly and carefully, as if in that mechanical motion she could preserve some control over the conversation slipping through her fingers. She placed 1 cup before him, but didn't look up. She stood straight, unbroken. He remained by the door, and between them, on the table, 2 cups released slow rhythms of steam. "Do you know what was the hardest part?" she asked at last, her voice low but unwavering. "That I never hated you." His breath caught in his throat, struck by a truth he hadn't expected. "And that," she continued, calm and even, each word soaked in a pain that doesn't scream, but corrodes in silence. "That was what hurt the most. That despite everything, I left you a place. In her. In me. Fred closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to defend himself from words that cut too deeply, because they weren't an accusation, but a truth laid bare. When he opened them again, the question trembling on his lips was almost inaudible. Is there any chance it could be different? Anya looked at him steadily, without surprise, and without even a trace of false hope. She was silent long enough for him to hear all the answers hidden within that silence. Not tonight, she said. Tonight you're here to see what you've lost, and maybe to learn how not to lose even more. Fred nodded, accepting the sentence, not with bitterness, but with a quiet awareness that it might be all he deserved. He hadn't come for forgiveness. Perhaps he never would. But tonight, he had something else. A presence. Hers. Fragile but real. The night deepened, spreading its dense silence, the kind in which words lose meaning, leaving only what they conceal. In the living room, the light was dim, and between them stretched a space filled with everything left unsaid. Fred sat on the edge of the armchair, still in uniform, holding the empty cup in his hands, as if clinging to the fading warmth. His gaze was restless. Anya stood by the table, upright, almost defiant in her quiet. And when she finally spoke again, her voice carried no sharpness, only unyielding truth. You can't stay. Fred looked up, unsurprised, as though he had known it already, as though he'd been waiting to hear the words spoken aloud. I know, he said softly, and I didn't think I could. A long pause stretched between them, fragile as cobweb silk no one dared to touch. But, he continued, his voice trembling almost imperceptibly, can I see her? Just for a moment. Anya watched him for a long time, and in her silence, there was no trace of a struggle between forgiveness and revenge, only the quiet, aching battle between pain and the instinct to protect what was still innocent. She's asleep, she said at last, softly, as though even the word itself might wake the child. Deeply. I know, he replied, and I wouldn't wake her. I just want to see her, to feel her. Anya closed her eyes, gathering within herself every reason that might stand against that wish. But in the end, she nodded. All right, but only for a moment. Fred rose carefully, almost timidly, like a man stepping into a life that didn't belong to him, yet one he still carried within his chest. He followed Anya down the hallway, each step weighted, as if the door ahead led not to a child's room, but to a mirror he had long avoided. The door creaked faintly as it opened, and beyond it, in the hush of the night, Kai slept. His daughter, his child. She was curled up, clutching a faded stuffed fox, worn soft from years of gentle touch. Her face was peaceful, free from the unrest of adulthood, her small fingers resting lightly against her rosy cheek. She looked like a dream he had imagined for years, but never dared to touch. Fred stepped inside, while Anya remained on the threshold, silent and steady, a witness to a moment that no longer belonged to her, but to him alone. He bent slowly, reverently, as though approaching an altar, and simply looked. In his eyes trembled sorrow, not loud or brutal, but the quiet kind that breaks from within because it has nowhere else to go. Regret carved itself into his features, but among all the emotions that flickered through him, one remained: tenderness, vast and muted, long suppressed, yet now rising like a tear that could no longer be held back. He reached out his hand, but stopped halfway, as if afraid that touching her might wake her from sleep, and at the same time shatter the fragile illusion that had kept him standing. Yet with a faint tremor in his fingers, he finally brushed her rosy cheek. The warmth of her skin spilled through him like a forgiveness he would never hear spoken, like time that had slipped away, but somehow still stood here, tangible and real. It was a simple gesture, but within it lived everything he had missed. His lips parted, but no words came, only a breath, uneven and shallow, as his heart beat wildly, searching for rhythm beside the small, peaceful being before him. Inside him raged a storm of regret, arriving too late, love he had never known how to show, grief for the years lost, and yet, hope. A fragile, stubborn hope that perhaps it was not too late after all. Our little blonde universe in pajamas. He looked toward Anya, and in her eyes, hard yet fragile, he saw what he had never been able to read before. The strength she had carried all those years without him, and the fracture through which, despite everything, something like trust still flickered. It wasn't full or unbroken trust. It was fragile, uncertain, the kind born only when a weary heart momentarily yields to the possibility that not everything is lost forever. He turned back once more toward the room, as if memorizing the child's face he had only just discovered. Then, gently, without a sound that might awaken the past, he stepped out and closed the door behind him, quieter than when he'd entered. They stood facing each other by the front door, surrounded by walls, hallway, and night, all breathing with the same quiet tension of words left unspoken. Fred glanced past her shoulder, toward the hallway that led to his daughter's room, and in that look, tried to carve a final trace, a shadow, a proof of the child who had just become more real to him than his own blood. His eyes, red from restrained grief, did not release tears, perhaps because he knew that once they fell, they would wash everything away, including him, her, and the fragile balance that kept their worlds from collapsing. Anya's hand rested on the doorknob, but she didn't open it. In that pause lay her entire struggle, the battle between the woman who wanted to drive him out of her life and the one who, despite everything, could not yet let him go. He spoke first, with a voice trembling at the edges. Do you know how many times I imagine this moment? The words came slowly, as though forcing their way through the layers of silence in which he had lived for years. She didn't interrupt. She only looked at him, with eyes that were both accusation and solace, both a wall and a mirror in which he saw everything he had run from. I never imagined it like this, he went on, lowering his gaze to the floor, unable to bear the weight of hers. I never imagined she'd be this big, that she wouldn't know me, that I'd be nothing but a stranger to her. You didn't know how to stay, she said quietly, but clearly. And in those words there was no anger, only a calm confession that held both blame and understanding. Fred nodded slowly, like a man who no longer hides from the truth and finally accepts it whole, unedited and unexcused. But tonight, he whispered, his voice stripped bare, tonight I wished, for the first time, that I wouldn't have to leave. Her eyes flickered, not from weakness, but from the effort to stay composed when any other gaze would have faltered. And yet, you're leaving, she said softly. He tried to smile, but it came out bitter, the quiet acknowledgement of everything he had lost. Because that's what I've become, he murmured. Someone who arrives too late and leaves too soon. The silence that followed no longer hurt the way it once had. It didn't cut or tear. It was softer, gentler, almost reconciled. Anya then opened the door slowly, deliberately, and the night greeted them with a cool breath, not hostile, only quiet and still. The wind passed through the trees, carrying a sound that bore witness to all the words spoken and the silence that had followed. Fred paused at the threshold, not rushing out, his eyes holding her form as though he wanted to carve it into memory, to keep it as a compass for the uncertain days ahead. Then he stepped forward slowly. He reached his car, opened the door, but didn't get in right away. Leaning against the roof, he looked toward the window behind which his daughter slept. He couldn't see her, but he felt her, as one feels the presence of a breath unseen, yet truer than anything else. Finally, he sat behind the wheel, started the engine quietly, without haste, and drove away down the street. The headlights slid across the wet asphalt before disappearing around the curve, leaving the night to fold its dark wings once more over the house. Anya stood in the doorway, still and calm, watching until the shadows swallowed him completely. In the air lingered his scent, on her skin the ghost of his unfinished touch, and in her mind the question she did not dare to speak aloud. Can you forgive someone who returns only when everything seems over? Or is that, perhaps, the very moment when everything begins again?